The confrontation. The clock neared 11 and the restaurant had begun to thin as the last wave of guests finished their desserts and sipped the final drops of wine from polished glasses. To most of them, the night had been perfect, a place of golden light, fine flavors, and laughter shared over plates of food. Yet beneath the gleam the truth festered like a wound. Vin could feel it in the heaviness of the staff's movements, in the strained smiles that flickered like candles in a draught, in the hushed sighs that leaked out when they thought no one was watching. He had lingered long enough, listening, observing, piecing together fragments of whispered stories and unspoken pain. And as Elena darted past once more, her body tightening when the manager's voice cut through the room, Vin knew he had reached the edge of patience. Watching was no longer enough. The time for silence had passed. The manager stood near the pass line, his voice a low but cutting blade directed at a server who had misdelivered a dish. His tone was cold, clipped, the kind that dressed itself as professionalism but carried cruelty in its undercurrent. The server, no older than 20, nodded quickly, his eyes lowered, his face flushed with humiliation as the guests at table 7 glanced over in confusion. The young man muttered an apology, scurried away, and the manager's eyes scanned the room again with predatory precision. Vin's jaw tightened beneath the shadow of his hoodie. This man believed he held control, believed that his authority was the glue holding Torx together, when in truth, he was the very weight pulling it apart. Vin rose from his stool slowly, deliberately, and crossed the floor with the steady stride of someone who had made up his mind. He didn't rush. He didn't storm. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet gravity of inevitability, as though every step had been written long before tonight. Guests hardly noticed him as he moved, but servers did. Their eyes followed him, uncertain but instinctively aware that something was about to shift. He stopped just short of the pass, where the manager stood with arms folded tightly across his chest. For a moment, Vin simply studied him, letting the silence stretch until the man finally turned, irritation flickering across his face at the sight of what he assumed was another meddling customer. "Sir, if you need something, you'll have to take a seat," the manager said sharply, his tone dismissive. "We're trying to keep the floor running smoothly." Vin tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, unflinching. "Are you?" he asked, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable weight. The manager frowned. "Excuse me?" "I asked if you're keeping the floor running smoothly," Vin repeated, his tone measured, low enough not to cause a scene but strong enough that staff nearby stilled, their ears perking. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're running it into the ground." A ripple of silence spread across the space, subtle but undeniable. A busser froze mid-step, a bartender paused with a glass in hand, and Elena, carrying a tray, stopped near the bar, her eyes wide with shock. The manager straightened, clearly unused to being challenged. "I don't know who you think you are," he began, his voice hardening, "but I don't take criticism from customers who don't understand how this business works." Vin allowed a moment of silence before he slowly pulled his hood back, revealing his face fully in the soft glow of the restaurant's lights. Gasps rippled quietly through the staff, and even a few guests turned their heads as recognition spread like a wave. The manager's expression faltered, his words catching in his throat as he finally understood the gravity of the man standing before him. "I understand this business better than you think," Vin said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "I built this place, brick by brick, recipe by recipe, hand in hand with people who believed in it. This isn't just a restaurant with my name on the sign. This is supposed to be a family, a home for the people who work here and for the people who walk through those doors. And what I've seen tonight, it's not the dream I built. It's not Torx." The silence deepened, heavy, almost sacred. Staff members glanced at one another, disbelief and relief flickering across their faces. Elena's lips parted as though she might speak, but no words came. Instead, tears welled quietly in her eyes once more. Not of despair this time, but of release, as though the weight she had been carrying had suddenly shifted. The manager, flustered, attempted to recover. "Mr. Diesel, with all due respect, you don't see everything. Running a restaurant isn't about dreams. It's about discipline, control. If I let up for even a moment, this place would fall apart." Vin stepped closer, his presence filling the space, his voice steady as stone. "Control doesn't build loyalty. Fear doesn't inspire excellence. You don't lift people by breaking them down. You lift them by reminding them they matter, by giving them a reason to care as much as you do. You want this place to succeed, you don't squeeze it tighter. You trust the people who keep it alive. His words rolled through the air like a current, reaching every corner of the restaurant. Staff members straightened subtly, their eyes reflecting hope that had long been dimmed. Even the guests, sensing the weight of the moment, fell silent, watching with quiet awe as the celebrity whose name they knew became something more, a leader fighting for his people. The manager sputtered, his authority crumbling. I was only trying to what? Vin cut in, his tone sharp now, the patience gone. Trying to silence them? Trying to strip them of their spirit? That's not leadership. That's cowardice. And it ends tonight. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Elena set her tray down on the bar, her hands trembling not with fear but with the overwhelming rush of vindication. For weeks, maybe months, they had endured in silence, believing their voices lost in the noise. And now, in a single confrontation, someone had spoken the words they had been too afraid to say. Vin's gaze swept the room, landing on each server, each busser, each bartender. You are not disposable, he said firmly, his voice carrying with the conviction of a vow. Every one of you matters. This restaurant doesn't exist without you, and I will not stand by and let anyone make you feel less than that. Not here, not in my house. The manager's face had paled, his body stiff. He looked as though he wanted to argue, to reclaim authority, but under the weight of Vin's presence and the undeniable shift in the room, the fight drained from him. He stepped back, his lips pressed thin, knowing without words that his time at Torx had come to an end. Vin turned toward the staff once more, his expression softening. Go ahead, finish the shift tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk. All of us together, because this place isn't just mine, it's ours. And it's time we start treating it that way. Applause didn't break out, this wasn't a movie. But what spread through the restaurant was something quieter, deeper. Relief, gratitude, the faint stirring of hope rekindled. Elena wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes meeting Vin's with a silent thank you more powerful than words. The cracks in the facade were no longer hidden, but now for the first time light was streaming through them, and Vin knew the confrontation was only the beginning. The real work, the rebuilding of trust, the healing of wounds, the restoration of dignity would come next. But tonight a line had been drawn. The weight of fear had been lifted, and in its place a new foundation could finally begin. Cracks in the facade, the clatter of plates and the steady hum of conversation filled Torx. Yet for Vin Diesel, seated inconspicuously at the bar, the night had taken on an entirely different rhythm. What to the customers looked like a well-oiled machine of hospitality was, to his trained and watchful eyes, a fragile system straining under invisible weight. He could see the tension that pulsed beneath the surface of every smile, every tray carried from kitchen to table, every order scribbled hastily on notepads. It reminded him of glass stretched to its breaking point, appearing smooth and flawless until the pressure became too great, and then shattering all at once. As he watched the dining room unfold, Vin paid attention to details others would miss. One server's forced laughter at a rude customer lingered just a second too long, the kind of laugh meant to mask the sting of disrespect. Another young busser dropped a fork near table 5 and immediately flinched as though expecting punishment, his eyes flicking instinctively toward the manager before he even stooped to retrieve it. The hostess, a bright-eyed college student Vin remembered hiring through a scholarship program, greeted guests with cheerful words, yet her voice cracked each time she said, "Welcome to Torx," as though the weight of her shift already pressed heavily on her chest. These were the fissures, the subtle cracks in the facade that most guests would never notice, but which told the true story of a workplace. And then, of course, there was the manager, navy shirt, as Vin had begun to think of him. The man's presence radiated unease across the room. He never smiled. He never encouraged. Instead, he circled like a hawk, waiting for the smallest slip to swoop in with whispered reprimands sharp enough to wound. The servers did not look to him for leadership. They looked past him, around him, through him, anything to avoid confrontation. Vin's stomach churned at the realization that he had entrusted his dream, his restaurant, to someone who seemed more concerned with control than with care. Numbers on spreadsheets might look healthy, but numbers could never measure the silent despair in a young woman's tears. The girl from the break room, Elena, as Vin would later learn her name, moved with a precision that bordered on robotic. Her hands no longer trembled as they had earlier, but that steadiness came not from calm but from desperation. She was forcing her body into submission, determined not to show weakness again. Vin knew this kind of strength all too well. It was the armor of those who carried burdens silently, the armor of people who believed that showing pain meant losing their place entirely. He admired her resilience even as it broke his heart, because resilience should be born of pride, not fear. A memory surfaced then, unbidden. Vin was 19 again, working late nights at a greasy spoon on the edge of Manhattan. He had been bussing tables when a customer berated him for moving too slowly, calling him lazy, worthless, destined for nothing. He remembered retreating to the kitchen, gripping the stainless steel counter just as Elena had, trying not to let his coworkers see the tears burning in his eyes. He had nearly quit that night, but an older cook, a man who had seen his share of hard times, had put a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Kid, you're worth more than their words. Don't let them break you." That single moment of kindness had kept him going, and in time, it became part of the fire that drove him to succeed. But what if Elena didn't have that voice reminding her of her worth? What if all she had were sharp criticisms, endless shifts, and the hollow comfort of holding herself together alone in a break room? Vin clenched his jaw at the thought. He had sworn Torx would be different. If it wasn't, then he had failed her. Failed all of them. As the night wore on, the cracks widened. A server emerged from the kitchen, his face pale, carrying a plate with a steak that had clearly been sent back. The customer had asked for medium rare, but the cut on the plate showed it leaning toward medium well. The server set it down on the counter near the pass and braced himself. Within seconds, Navy Shirt appeared, his face tightening, his voice a sharp hiss that carried even through the din of the restaurant. "How many times have I told you to check the plates before they leave the kitchen?" The server tried to explain, but the manager cut him off with a curt gesture, his tone low enough not to alarm guests but biting enough to reduce the young man's confidence to dust. The server nodded, muttered an apology, and vanished back into the crowd, his shoulders sagging under the weight of invisible shame. Vin watched it all, fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't leadership. This was corrosion. A leader corrected mistakes by guiding, not by humiliating. A leader inspired people to improve, not terrified them into silence. If this was how the staff was treated in plain view, what happened behind closed doors? The thought tightened his chest like a vice. He knew he couldn't sit by any longer, but still he resisted the urge to leap up and reveal himself. Timing mattered. If he confronted Navy Shirt now, in the middle of a bustling Friday night, chaos would erupt and the staff might end up more fearful, more uncertain, unsure whether their jobs were safe. What they needed was not a spectacle but a transformation. What they needed was hope. So Vin decided on a different tactic, observation combined with quiet connection. He caught the bartender's attention once more and struck up a conversation, this time steering it toward the staff. With carefully chosen words and gentle curiosity, he encouraged her to share small truths. Slowly she did. She mentioned how some of the newer servers struggled to keep up with expectations, how mistakes seemed unforgivable under the current management, how morale had dipped even though business was booming. She didn't say much. Loyalty and fear kept her guarded. But she said enough to confirm what Vin already suspected. There was a sickness spreading through his restaurant, and it was eating away at the spirit of the very people who made it run. As the night pushed toward 10 o'clock, Vin's focus narrowed again on Elena. She moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, delivering plates, refilling glasses, smiling through her weariness. But each time she brushed past Navy Shirt, her body seemed to shrink as though she wished to disappear. Vin's heart ached at the sight. He had once stood in her shoes, knowing what it meant to give everything and still feel like you were never enough. He vowed silently, then and there, that this young woman would not be broken on his watch. And so, while the restaurant gleamed with golden light and customers laughed over decadent meals, Vin Diesel, hidden beneath a hoodie, anonymous in his own creation, saw the cracks in the facade widening with every passing moment. He knew what came next. He would have to step out of the shadows, not yet with a declaration of ownership, but with quiet words, listening ears, and the kind of presence that could remind these people they were not alone. The true test of Torx was not whether it could serve the finest steak in Los Angeles, The true test was whether it could withstand the weight of human hearts. And tonight, Vin realized the weight was heavier than he had ever imagined. Rebuilding the heart the following morning, sunlight streamed through the wide windows of tWhat's, illuminating the polished wood tables and the gleaming surfaces that only hours ago had been witness to exhaustion, tension, and a silent confrontation that had shifted everything. The restaurant was quieter now, stripped of the music and chatter of guests, and in that quiet hung a kind of fragile expectation. For the first time in a long time, the staff did not know exactly what awaited them. Rumors had already spread overnight. Vin Diesel had been there in disguise, and he had seen everything. He had spoken directly, without filter or distance, and more than that, he had promised change. When the staff arrived for the pre-shift meeting, they did not file in with the weary resignation of habit. Instead, they walked cautiously, curiously, carrying the weight of uncertainty but also the spark of something long forgotten: hope. Elena lingered near the back, clutching her notepad as though it were a shield. Her eyes were still swollen from tears shed the night before. But when she looked at the front of the room and saw Vin standing there, not in a hoodie this time, but in a simple t-shirt and jeans, her breath caught. He wasn't a movie star today. He wasn't a figure on a billboard. He was simply a man, grounded, present, looking each of them in the eye as though he had known them all along. Vin waited until the room settled, until the hum of whispers quieted, before he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, filled not with authority but with sincerity. "First, I want to thank you," he began. "Thank you for showing up today. Thank you for carrying this restaurant on your shoulders night after night. Thank you for being the reason people walk out of here with memories that matter. I built tWhat's with the idea that it would be more than just another place to eat. I wanted it to be a home for all of you, as much as for the guests. But last night I saw something that broke me. I saw fear, I saw pain, and I saw people feeling like they didn't matter. That's not the dream I promised. That's not who we are." The staff listened, still guarded but undeniably drawn in by the gravity of his words. He wasn't reading from a script. He wasn't delivering a performance. He was confessing in real time that somewhere along the way things had gone wrong, and that acknowledgement alone was something they had longed to hear but never expected. Vin continued, his eyes moving from face to face. "I know what it's like to be where you are. I've worked the late nights, carried trays until my arms ached, scrubbed kitchens until my back gave out. I know what it feels like to cry in the back where no one sees you, because you think you don't matter enough to be heard. And I swore to myself that if I ever built something, I would make sure the people in it never felt that way. Last night I realized I failed at keeping that promise, and I'm here to tell you I won't fail you again." The silence was heavy but no longer oppressive. It was attentive, alive, filled with the quiet beating of hearts daring to believe him. Elena's throat tightened, and she blinked back tears she hadn't expected. She had heard apologies before in life, but this one felt different. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an invitation to rebuild. Vin gestured for them to sit, and he pulled up a chair himself, refusing the distance of a stage or podium. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, leaning forward. "We're going to reset together. This restaurant doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to all of us because every smile you give, every dish you carry, every extra step you take, it's you that makes this place alive. And that means your voices matter. From now on, we're going to meet like this every week. You'll tell me what's working and what's not. No more silence. No more fear. If something breaks, we fix it. If someone's hurting, we help them. That's how we move forward." There was a stir among the staff, a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. They weren't used to being invited into the conversation. They weren't used to the idea that their voices might carry weight in shaping the place where they spent their lives. One of the older line cooks, a man with hands scarred from years of heat and blades, raised his chin and asked quietly, "And what about him?" He didn't say the manager's name, but everyone knew who he meant. Vin's eyes hardened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "He's no longer part of this family," he said firmly. "Leadership is not about fear. Leadership is about respect, and respect is something you deserve." The words spread like fire through the room, igniting something buried deep. Shoulders lifted, breaths released. A few quiet claps turned into an earnest round of applause, not loud, not theatrical, but deeply real. Elena clapped softly too, her hands trembling as relief surged through her body. For the first time in months, she felt seen, felt valued, felt safe. Over the next days and weeks, Vin kept his word. He wasn't just a distant owner checking in with spreadsheets. He became a presence. He walked the floor not as a boss but as a partner. He shadowed servers during shifts, carrying trays with them, bussing tables, even washing dishes late into the night. He shared his own stories of failure and struggle, reminding them that no one, not even someone with fame and fortune, had gotten anywhere without scars. He invited their suggestions, listened when they spoke, and implemented changes where they were needed. Break times were adjusted, schedules became more humane, and recognition for hard work became a regular part of the culture. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but slowly, the energy began to change. Smiles returned, not the forced kind, but the genuine ones. The laughter in the break room grew louder, lighter, no longer strained by the fear of who might be listening. Even the food seemed to taste better because it was served not with dread but with pride. Guests noticed too. They didn't know the full story, but they felt the warmth in the service, the renewed spark in the atmosphere. Torx was becoming what it was always meant to be. For Elena, the change was profound. She still had long nights, still felt the weight of bills and responsibilities, but she no longer carried it alone. She began to speak up in meetings, shy at first, then with growing confidence. She shared ideas for improving table flow, suggested small touches to make guests feel more welcome, even helped train new hires with a patience she hadn't known she possessed. Vin noticed her every step of the way, offering encouragement, reminding her of her worth. And in that environment, she began to dream again, not just of surviving, but of building a future she hadn't dared imagine. One evening, after the last guests had left and the staff sat together for a simple family meal, Elena found herself laughing freely with her coworkers. She caught Vin watching from across the table, his expression soft, proud, not of himself but of them. She realized then what had truly changed. This was no longer just a restaurant. It was a family. It was a place where the cracks in the facade had been repaired, not with plaster but with care, with truth, with heart. And as she left that night, stepping into the cool Los Angeles air, Elena whispered a quiet thank you to Vin, to her coworkers, to herself, for holding on through the darkest nights. The rebuild was far from finished, but the foundation was strong. And for the first time in a long time, she believed the future could be brighter than the past. The weight of the kitchen. The break room door closed softly behind the young man who had been consoling the crying server. His face was flushed, his eyes darting nervously as though he feared the manager might notice he had disappeared from the floor for too long. He adjusted his apron, squared his shoulders, and slipped back into the storm of the dinner rush with the kind of forced composure only those in hospitality understood. Smile plastered on the face, even when the soul was somewhere else. From his stool at the bar, Vin caught every detail. Years in this industry taught him to read body language the way others read menus. This wasn't the walk of someone taking a quick breather. It was the walk of a soldier returning to the battlefield after watching a comrade wounded. Vin didn't turn toward the break room right away. He knew better than to storm in. If he barged through that door, he'd be a stranger, a hooded man invading a private moment. No, the truth required patience, and patience required blending in. He ordered a ribeye from the bartender, not because he was hungry, but because sitting too long without food might attract attention. While the restaurant buzzed around him, his mind remained in that room with the young woman clutching the counter. He tried to imagine her world for a moment. Friday night, one of the hardest shifts in the business. 100 small demands flying at you from all directions. Table 9 needs another bottle of Chardonnay. Table 12 is allergic to shellfish. Table 3 wants to send back a perfectly good plate of pasta because they changed their mind. Servers lived at the intersection of grace and chaos. But her tears hadn't sounded like the ordinary stress of the shift. No, Vin knew what that sounded like. Exhausted sighs, muttered curses in the kitchen, or the quick venting on smoke breaks. This had been quieter, more fragile. And when he replayed the sight of her fingers digging into the counter, he recognized the grip of someone who felt like they were hanging on to more than just the job. As his steak arrived, Vin scanned the floor again. The manager was pacing now, stopping to whisper sharp words into the ear of a young busser who immediately flushed red and scurried toward the kitchen. A couple of servers stiffened when the man passed by, their bodies tightening with that instinctive recoil people have when they fear being singled out. It was subtle, invisible to most diners enjoying their night out. But Vin's trained eye caught it all. The way people avoided eye contact with him. The way smiles dropped the second his back turned. The way conversations between staff were clipped and rushed. This was not rhythm. This was pressure, and pressure left unchecked always cracked the foundation. Vin cut into the ribeye, chewing slowly, not tasting it, his mind moving back through time. He remembered working in a small New York diner, where the manager was a tyrant who believed humiliation was the best motivator. He'd once been forced to scrub a kitchen floor on his knees for an hour, while guests laughed in the dining room, all because he had forgotten to garnish a plate with parsley. He could still hear the echo of his own silent tears in the back alley that night, hidden under the din of garbage trucks. That memory was the reason Torx had been built differently. At least it was supposed to be. What had changed? He glanced toward the kitchen doors again, debating his next move. That was when he noticed the young woman, the one from the break room, emerging. She had pulled her hair back into a tight bun, but stray strands clung to her damp cheeks, betraying the recent tears. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her smile was forced into place like armor. She carried a tray of cocktails, shoulders squared, and moved toward a group of Hollywood types in tailored suits. From a distance, she looked like every other polished server, but Vin saw through it. He saw the way her hands trembled slightly when she set the drinks down, the way her lips quivered before she forced them into a smile. It took strength to walk out like that. More strength than most people realized. And it broke his heart. The manager swooped in suddenly, his tall frame looming as he intercepted her near the kitchen doors. Vin watched closely as the man leaned in, his voice low, his expression sharp. The girl nodded quickly, her smile faltering for half a second, then scurried back to the bar to grab something else. The manager's jaw remained tight as he scanned the floor again, his eyes predatory. Vin had seen enough. But this wasn't the moment for confrontation. Not yet. He needed to understand the story before he could step in. A single outburst could make him the villain instead of the savior if he didn't have the full truth. He took another sip of his water, then signaled the bartender. "Hey," he said casually, his voice low but steady. "Busy night, huh?" The bartender exhaled, rolled her eyes briefly, then caught herself. "Every Friday's like this," she replied, wiping down the counter. "You holding up okay?" he asked, his tone easy but his eyes steady. She studied him for a beat, unsure why a stranger would ask. Then she shrugged. "You get used to it. Some nights better than others," Vin nodded. "And tonight?" She hesitated, her hand stilling on the rag. Her eyes flicked quickly toward the manager across the room before returning to Vin. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tonight's busy." That told him enough. Vin leaned back in his stool, letting silence do the work. The bartender moved away to pour another drink, but he knew he'd struck a nerve. That kind of quick glance toward a manager spoke volumes. Fear had a way of leaking out in tiny gestures, and Vin caught it every time. The young woman, the one who had been crying, returned to the bar a few minutes later. Her tray was empty, but her face was taut with forced composure. The bartender handed her a ticket, and she began assembling another set of cocktails. Vin studied her movements. Every gesture was careful, precise, mechanical. It was the kind of focus that came not from pride in the craft, but from fear of making a mistake. As she reached for a bottle on the top shelf, her hand slipped slightly, the glass clinking against another. It didn't break, but it was loud enough to draw the manager's attention. His head snapped toward her, his expression hard. Vin saw her freeze for a fraction of a second before forcing a laugh, as though the sound were nothing. The manager narrowed his eyes, then turned away. But the damage was done. She was rattled, and Vin's stomach twisted with frustration. He wanted to march over there, throw off his hoodie, and remind every soul in the room whose name was on the front of the building. But that wasn't leadership. That was ego. And ego wouldn't fix the problem at its root. No, he needed to go deeper. He finished his steak slowly, each bite heavy with thought. When the young woman finally stepped away from the bar with another tray, Vin caught her eye for the briefest moment. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. And in that second, he saw it. The exhaustion, the weight, the silent plea for something to change. Vin leaned forward, his elbows on the bar, his decision made. He wasn't leaving tonight until he understood her story. Because if his restaurant had become a place where people cried in silence out of fear, then it wasn't a restaurant anymore. It was just another machine grinding people down, and that was not the legacy he had promised to build. The hum of torques continued around him, laughter, music, sizzling pans. But Vin's world had narrowed to one truth. There was a storm behind those kitchen doors, and he was about to walk straight into it. Conversations and shadows. The restaurant had begun to quiet just slightly as the night wore on. The initial frenzy of the dinner rush had passed, leaving behind a steady but calmer rhythm as latecomers lingered over wine and desserts. To the guests, it was the perfect end to a night of indulgence, but to the staff it was merely the second half of a long battle. Plates still needed to be cleared, orders still came in, and tired feet still carried weight across the polished floor. It was in this subtle shift, this thinning of noise and pace, that Vin decided the moment had come. He rose from his stool at the bar, moving as though aimlessly, and slipped toward the narrow hallway where staff occasionally disappeared with trays or emerged carrying extra supplies. He leaned against the wall near the water station, his cap still pulled low, his hoodie blending him into the background. From here he could watch without obstructing, listen without demanding. A few moments later, Elena appeared again. She carried an empty tray tucked under her arm, her body moving with mechanical precision. Her eyes, though, betrayed the kind of weariness that no smile could disguise. When she set the tray down, Vin spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with the gentle tone of someone making an observation rather than asking a question. "Long night?" he said, his voice warm, almost casual, as though he were just another sympathetic guest. Elena startled slightly, not expecting to be addressed. She glanced at him quickly, her eyes flicking up and down, assessing him in the half-second every server uses to decide if a stranger is safe to engage with. She gave a quick, practiced smile. "Every night's long," she replied, the kind of answer that concealed more than it revealed. Vin nodded, leaning back slightly as if he had no intention of prying. "I get that. I used to work in restaurants, back in New York. I know what it feels like to carry trays when your feet already feel like bricks." Something in his tone made her pause. Servers were used to polite guests, even complimentary ones, but few spoke with the weight of shared experience. She tilted her head slightly, curious despite herself. "Yeah, where'd you work?" "Little places," Vin said vaguely, choosing his words carefully. He wanted to connect, not reveal. Diners, a few small restaurants, the kind where the dishwasher sometimes had to run food if it got busy. Places where you learned quickly that a single mistake could ruin your night. Her smile faltered and her eyes softened just a fraction. She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more meaning than words. "Yeah," she murmured almost to herself. "I know that feeling." Vin didn't push. He let the silence stretch just long enough to become comfortable rather than awkward. Finally he asked, "You okay?" The question was simple, but it was not the shallow, "How are you doing?" tossed out by strangers expecting a quick, "Fine." His tone carried weight, sincerity, the kind that pierced defenses. Elena's hands stilled on the edge of the counter, her knuckles white against the stainless steel. For a moment she looked as though she might brush it off, but then her eyes flicked toward the dining room where the manager was pacing again, and her voice dropped lower. "Depends on who's asking," she whispered. Vin felt the air shift. Here it was, the moment where truth hovered on the edge of breaking free. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady, calm, and without judgment. "Just someone who's been there. Someone who knows what it's like to fight through nights like this." Her lips pressed together tightly, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, as though a dam had cracked, words began to spill quietly. "It's not the work," she said, her voice trembling. "I can handle the work. I've worked doubles, triples, gone home at 2 a.m. and come back at 10 the next day. That part's fine, it's—" She stopped, her throat tightening, her eyes glistening again. "It's the way we're treated. Like we're disposable, like no matter how hard we try, it's never enough. You mess up one order and you're the worst server in the building. You drop a glass and it's like you've cost the place a fortune. I don't know how much longer I can take it." Vin listened without interrupting. Every word landed heavy in his chest, not just because of her pain, but because it was happening here, in his house, under his name. He wanted to tell her right then and there that she wasn't disposable, that this place had been built for people like her, not against them. But he knew that revealing his identity too soon would shift the conversation. Right now she needed to believe she was speaking to someone neutral, Someone who had no power over her job, someone safe. "I hear you," he said finally, his voice low. "I know it feels like you're carrying the whole world sometimes. And when the people who should have your back make it harder instead of easier, that's the worst kind of weight." Her eyes flicked to his face, studying him again as though trying to figure out why this stranger's words struck so deeply. She didn't know who he was, and yet she felt a strange comfort in the way he spoke, as if he understood in ways others didn't. For a moment, she allowed her defenses to lower, just slightly. "Sometimes I think about just walking out," she admitted, her voice cracking, "leaving mid-shift, never coming back. But then I remember the bills and the rent and my mom who needs help with her medicine, and I tell myself to push through one more night. But every night feels heavier." Vin's jaw tightened, though he forced his expression to remain neutral. Inside, though, he burned with frustration at the thought of someone in his restaurant being driven to this edge. But he also felt admiration, because despite everything, she still showed up, still pushed forward, still carried trays with trembling hands because quitting wasn't an option. That was strength even if she didn't see it yet. "Walking away is easy," Vin said softly. "Staying, that takes courage. But courage doesn't mean you should suffer. It means knowing your worth even when others don't. Don't ever forget that." Elena blinked, caught between tears and gratitude. Before she could respond, the sharp voice of the manager cut across the dining room, calling her name. She stiffened instantly, her shoulders rising, her face snapping back into the mask of a server ready to perform. She gave Vin a quick nod, a silent acknowledgement, then hurried back into the fray. Vin remained in the hallway, his thoughts heavy. He had heard enough now to confirm the truth. This wasn't a case of one bad night or an overwhelmed employee. This was deeper. This was a culture problem, one rooted in the very leadership he had entrusted with his restaurant. And if he didn't act soon, it would break not only Elena but many others as well. As he returned to his seat at the bar, he made eye contact with another server, a young man with tired eyes who had been moving nonstop since the night began. Vin offered him a smile, just a small gesture, but the server's expression softened for a second, as though even that tiny spark of humanity reminded him he wasn't invisible. Vin tucked the moment into his heart, knowing that sometimes it was the smallest conversations in the shadows that carried the greatest light. And though he hadn't revealed his identity, he knew he had just begun to plant the seeds of change. The real confrontation was coming. But before it did, he would continue to listen, continue to watch, continue to remind these people, quietly and subtly, that they mattered, for the cracks in the facade were widening, and through those cracks, truth was beginning to seep out. Vin would be there waiting, ready to turn those whispers into something stronger, into voices that could no longer be silenced. The silent entrance Vin Diesel knew that even the brightest lights of Hollywood cast shadows. Fame, fortune, and accolades could build a fortress around a man, but walls had cracks, and sometimes the best way to remember who you were was to step quietly into places where nobody expected you. That night in Los Angeles, Vin decided it was time to slip into his own restaurant again. Unannounced, unnoticed, unseen, Torque's, his pride and gamble, wasn't just another celebrity-branded hotspot meant to dazzle tourists. From the start, Vin had sworn it would be more than that. He poured his sweat into its design, its menu, its staff. He remembered long nights testing recipes with his head chef, arguing about the perfect cut of ribeye, the right olive oil for drizzling, the wine list that balanced elegance with accessibility. For him, Torque's was memory and mission combined. A place where both a studio intern could celebrate payday and a studio mogul could toast a deal. It was nearly 8 p.m. on a Friday when he stepped out of his car a block away. His hoodie up, a pair of jeans faded at the knees, baseball cap pulled low. He didn't want fanfare. He wanted truth. The truth of a restaurant was never in Yelp reviews or glossy magazines. It lived in the crackling energy of the kitchen, the hustle of the servers, the tired jokes traded at the end of a double shift. As he rounded the corner, the hum of Torque's reached him before the sight did. Laughter spilling from the patio, the low thrum of jazz weaving into clinking silverware. The neon sign, a bold T glowing against the night, greeted him as warmly as an old friend. He paused a moment on the sidewalk, hands in pockets, breathing in. Garlic, butter-seared meat, rosemary. The air itself felt like a promise fulfilled. He pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. The place was alive. Servers in sleek black uniforms darted between tables, balancing trays of steak and pasta and shimmering cocktails. The chandeliers, soft and golden, washed every table in warmth. Couples leaned close, friends raised glasses. A family of 4 laughed at a shared joke. From the outside, anyone would have said Torx was thriving. Vin moved toward the bar, nodding briefly at the bartender, a tall woman with braids pulled back, who was too busy shaking a drink to notice him. Perfect. That was how he wanted it. Just another customer. But he'd been in enough kitchens in his life to know something subtle. The way staff carried themselves spoke louder than the food or the decor. He scanned the floor. His manager, tall and rigid in a navy blue dress shirt, stood near the host podium with arms folded too tightly. His eyes weren't warm. They were hawkish, fixed on servers like a drill sergeant rather than a leader. Vin frowned slightly under the brim of his cap. He recognized that stance, control without compassion, numbers without nuance. He slid onto a bar stool, his body relaxed but his mind alert. A Friday dinner rush should carry stress, yes, but also rhythm like a symphony. Tonight, though, he sensed discord beneath the surface hum. Then he heard it. At first it was faint, almost lost under the chatter. A soft, muffled sound drifting from the side hallway near the kitchen. He froze, straining his ears. Again the sound came, quiet, shaky, the unmistakable rhythm of suppressed crying. Vin's chest tightened. He rose from the bar slowly, pretending to adjust his hoodie, and drifted toward the hallway. The door to the break room was slightly ajar. Through the gap he caught a glimpse. A young woman in uniform, head bowed, fingers gripping the edge of a metal counter like she was holding herself together. Another server, a young man maybe in his 20s, stood close, whispering urgently, trying to console her. Vin stopped cold. The cry wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of cry someone lets out when they've been holding back for too long, when they don't want to break in front of others but can't help it anymore. For a moment, time froze for him. The sound cut deeper than any harsh review, any box office flop, any personal criticism. This was his restaurant, his sanctuary for people, and here, one of his own was breaking. He pulled back slightly, careful not to intrude, and leaned against the wall, his mind racing. Not stress, he muttered under his breath. Fear. He knew the difference. He'd worked in restaurants as a struggling actor before the big breaks. He'd seen managers who pushed people past exhaustion, customers who treated servers like furniture, co-workers who broke down silently in walk-in freezers. He'd been the guy mopping floors at 2 a.m., still hearing echoes of someone's tears from the shift before. This was personal. Vin turned back toward the bar, his face calm, movements measured. He sat again, ordered a sparkling water, and kept his gaze low. Outwardly, just another diner. Inwardly, his mind churned like an engine. Who was she? Why was she crying? Was it the workload, the manager, something deeper? He sipped the water slowly, eyes flicking toward the manager again. Navy shirt still stood like a sentinel, eyes scanning, jaw tight. The man's posture screamed control, not leadership. Vin's jaw clenched. He'd seen this archetype before. Managers who believed authority came from fear instead of respect. The bartender slid him a menu. He nodded politely but barely glanced. He wasn't here for steak tonight. He was here for truth. A memory struck him suddenly, his mother's voice when he was a kid. Pay attention to the ones who don't speak loud. Mark. Sometimes their silence tells the biggest story. That's what this was. A silent cry hidden behind stainless steel doors. A story waiting to be uncovered. He decided then, he wasn't leaving until he knew what was happening. But if there was one thing Vin Diesel had learned in both Hollywood and life, it was patience. You don't get the truth by storming in. You earn it by watching, listening, and stepping in when the moment is right. So he waited. And while he waited, he remembered. He remembered being 22, broke, washing dishes in a diner in New York City, while chasing auditions that never called back. He remembered nights when exhaustion swallowed him whole and how one kind word from a line cook had kept him going. He remembered the sting of being invisible, of crying in silence, of feeling like the world didn't care. He'd sworn long ago that if he ever had the power to create spaces, on screen or in real life, they would be safe spaces. Not just profitable, not just flashy, but human. and now one of those spaces was cracking. Vin set his glass down and let his eyes wander the restaurant floor. A couple laughed over wine, a family toasted with mocktails, friends dug into pasta, oblivious to the storm hidden behind the break room door. That's the thing about restaurants. The magic for customers often hid the chaos behind the curtain. But the truth mattered, because what was success if it came at the cost of someone breaking inside your walls? No, not here. Not Torx. Vin leaned forward slightly, his reflection staring back at him in the polished bar top. His own eyes looked back, steady, resolved. The night had just begun, and he was going to find out why one of his servers was crying. A restaurant with soul months passed, and with them, the quiet miracle of change. Torx, once a place where golden light hid shadows, became something else entirely, a sanctuary. It was not that the pressures of running a restaurant disappeared. There were still late nights, busy shifts, moments of exhaustion when trays grew heavy and orders piled high. But the difference lay in the way those burdens were shared. Where once the weight had isolated, now it was carried together, lifted by hands that no longer trembled with fear but steadied with trust. Guests still came for the food, still marveled at the rich flavors and elegant atmosphere, but increasingly they stayed for something harder to define. There was warmth here, a kind of invisible current that wove through every plate, every greeting, every smile. They could feel it even if they could not name it, and that feeling brought them back again and again. For Vin, the transformation was not something measured in revenue reports or magazine reviews. It was written in the faces of the people who made Torx alive each day. It was in the way Elena now carried herself with quiet confidence, guiding new hires through the chaos of their first shift with a patience born from her own trials. It was in the laughter that spilled from the break room during staff meals, in the way cooks and servers shared jokes as though they were family, rather than colleagues bound by obligation. It was in the absence of tears hidden in hallways, replaced instead by conversations where frustrations were aired openly, and solutions sought together. This, Vin thought, was what success truly looked like. Not numbers on a page, but hearts unburdened and spirits restored. Elena's journey had become, in many ways, the mirror of Torx's rebirth. Where once she had gripped the counter to steady herself through silent sobs, now she stood at pre-shift meetings with ideas that others leaned in to hear. She had begun taking classes in hospitality management, encouraged and supported by Vin himself, who saw in her not just resilience but leadership waiting to bloom. She no longer spoke of quitting in whispered desperation. Instead, she spoke of goals, of how to make Torx not just a place to work but a place where people wanted to belong. One evening, when she received a round of applause from her peers after suggesting a new system that streamlined service, she flushed with pride, realizing she had found a voice she once believed she didn't have. The guests noticed the difference, though most never knew the story behind it. They described Torx as alive, as welcoming, as a place that feels different from anywhere else. Food critics wrote about the flavors and textures, but often slipped in a line about the staff's energy, about how rare it was to find a restaurant where service carried both professionalism and genuine joy. Word spread not only of the meals but of the experience, and soon Torx became not just a destination but a symbol, a place where hospitality meant humanity. Vin often found himself reflecting during those late hours after closing. When the chairs were stacked and the hum of the kitchen had quieted, he would walk through the empty dining room, fingertips brushing the polished tables, remembering the night he had slipped in anonymously, only to hear a young woman's muffled tears. That night had nearly broken him, but it had also given him the chance to rebuild something stronger, something real. Fame had taught him many lessons, but none as profound as this: that true legacy was not measured in ticket sales or box office numbers, but in the lives you touched when no cameras were rolling. One particular night, months after the confrontation, Vin stayed late as the staff gathered for their weekly meeting. They had finished service with smiles still intact, and though exhaustion lingered in their bodies, there was laughter in the air. Elena stood near the front, leading part of the discussion with a natural authority that surprised even her. She outlined ideas for seasonal specials, suggested small gestures to make staff birthdays memorable, and emphasized the importance of treating every guest with the same dignity. Whether they wore designer suits or thrift store jackets, Vin watched quietly, his heart swelling with pride. recognizing that leadership had already begun to take root in her. When the meeting ended and the staff dispersed, Elena lingered. She approached Vin with hesitant steps, her eyes searching his. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "not just for that night, but for everything after. You didn't just save us from him. You gave us back our voices. You gave me back mine." Vin shook his head gently, a small smile playing at his lips. "You already had your voice, Elena. All I did was remind you it was there. The strength was always yours." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment words failed her, but the gratitude she carried needed no explanation. She nodded, a silent promise that she would carry forward what she had learned, not only here but wherever life took her. Later, as Vin stepped outside into the cool night air, he looked up at the glowing Torque sign and felt a deep sense of peace. This was no longer just a restaurant. It was no longer just his. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of respect, compassion, and the refusal to let fear dictate the rhythm of people's lives. The soul of Torque's was no longer hidden. It pulsed openly in every corner, in every laugh, in every dream nurtured within its walls. And as Vin walked down the quiet street, hoodie pulled once more over his head. He carried with him the certainty that this, above all the roles he had ever played, was the one that mattered most. He had not just built a restaurant. He had helped build a family. And families, unlike facades, did not crack under pressure. They endured, they healed, and they shone.